Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Louise Upston.
I move that the question be now put.
No. I call the honourable member Grant Roberts.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I want to pick up on the excellent contribution from my colleague Chris Hipkins on SOP number 41, and also a contribution by Leanne Dalzell, and also a little stumble there, a contribution by other members around the House as well. It's only water, don't worry. What I really want to do is pick up for the most part, on Mr Hipkins's concerns about the division of the bill into only 2 bills. Because I actually think this is a quite serious matter. Because when we look at what is in Part 1, which makes up the majority of what will now be called the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, we see a number of matters covered. We see amendments to the State-Owned Enterprises Act 1986, and it would be quite logical in the system that we use in this Parliament to call any bill that amends those the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act. So on that count, we can be satisfied. But then we look at what were clauses 6 to 11 of Part 1, which now makes up the part of the divided bill here, a divided act here, and we see there amendments to the Ombudsman's Act 1975. The Minister and the Chair wasn't in the House in 1975, but I'm sure he can provide us some guidance around the question of whether or not it is actually possible to create something called the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, and in doing so amend the Ombudsman's Act and not directly split the bill up to amend the actual Ombudsman's Act. So to remind the House, Mr Chair, what is being divided here, the amendments to the Ombudsman's Act of 1975 that are now forming part of the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act that were in Part 1, Clause 6 of the Mixed Ownership Model Bill, is in fact to remove Genesis Power Limited, Meridian Energy Limited, Mighty River Power Limited and Solid Energy New Zealand Limited from the Ombudsman Act. Take them right out, remove the accountability on those matters, and completely take out the ability of New Zealanders to actually find out what's going on in these companies that allegedly, according to the government, we still own nearly half of. So they've gone. They've gone from the Ombudsman's Act. Surely, Mr Chair, that would be an occasion to have a complete new act called the Ombudsman Amendment Act, rather than have it under the State-Owned Enterprises Act. No, that's right. In fact, it could have a number of names. That's right, Mr Peters. It could be called the Ombudsman Sidelining Act. It could be called the Ombudsman Hiding Information from New Zealanders Act. There are many different names that people call. But whatever, Mr Chair, it should be an act of itself. I simply can't understand how it can be part of the State-Owned Enterprises Act. It doesn't describe what's being done. It doesn't explain to New Zealanders that their rights to take issues to the Ombudsman about companies that they previously have owned all of and under this government will own less than that, less than half of that over time, I'm sure. They should have the right, Mr Chair, to have a piece of legislation in front of this House called the Ombudsman Repeal Act, the Ombudsman Hiding from the Public Act, whatever we would choose, name we would choose to give it. And so I simply can't understand why the government has only split this bill in this motion into 2. If we then move to the next of the pieces that are now covered under the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, this is what was previously covered in Clause 7 of Part 1 of the Mixed Ownership Model Bill. These are amendments to the Official Information Act. And this amends the Official Information Act to repeal the item relating to Solid Energy New Zealand Limited. So that means this is a significant change and would be deserving of its own piece of legislation, I would have thought. We need to explain what that change is. The change is that New Zealanders who previously would have thought that the Official Information Act would apply to an entity that they own, to an entity that even under this proposal they have at least some ownership of, we're told by the government. Surely that would be something of such significance that New Zealanders can no longer use the Official Information Act to find out what's actually going on in Solid Energy, so much for control of it, Mr Chair, that would justify an Official Information Hiding What's Happening in Solid Energy Amendment Act, or an Official Information Taking Away the Rights of New Zealanders to Information about Assets that they own Act, an Amendment Act. All of those things would be more accurate descriptions, Mr Chair, than the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act. That does not describe what is happening here. That does not describe, Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Grant
Thank
Robertson.
you, Mr Chair. That does not describe to New Zealanders what is going on here. So now we have a situation where, under SOP number 41 that we're discussing here, the bill has been split into two. We have the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, and we have the Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model, but we don't have any reference to the Ombudsman's Act, to the Official Information Act, or indeed to the Income Tax Act, which are clearly distinct parts of what was part one of this bill. So I think the Minister does need to stand up and answer to the House why this is happening. I could posit some reasons for him, Mr Chair. It would be more constructive, I suspect, if the Minister were to get up and do that, but I could posit some reasons. I'd say that one of those reasons is that the government doesn't want New Zealanders to know that their rights under the Official Information Act and under the Ombudsman's Act are being taken away in this legislation. That would be one reason why the government was only splitting this bill into two parts rather than the many parts that would accurately describe what has happened here. So it seems quite clear to me, Mr Chair, that we actually have a serious issue within SOP number 41. We are not allowed to debate the substance and the merits of what has happened within this, but it is quite clear to me, having listened to the debate and participated in the debate, that members raised many SOPs, many amendments, many issues relating to changes to the Ombudsman's Act and changes to the Official Information Act. These are acts that lie at the core of our democracy, Mr Chair. These are the things that enable New Zealanders to know what's going on in public companies and entities in which they have an interest, in which all New Zealanders have an interest. And yet today, the government is blithely putting all of that under something called the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, half of which is in this motion. I simply don't think that describes what's happening here. I don't think it's accurate in terms of the history, and as Mr Hipkin said, of how we describe laws in New Zealand.
It's a change from practice.
That's right, it is a change from previous practice. We haven't had a single explanation from the government side about why they've decided to completely ignore the fact that they are amending the Ombudsman's Act and the Official Information Act, let alone, I might add, the Income Tax Act. Now, the Income Tax Act does get amended more often in this House, Mr Chair. I absolutely accept that. But again, these are very important items in terms of the overall accounts of New Zealand. If we look at what the amendments are, so what was formerly Part 1, clauses 9, 10 and 11 of Part 1, they are serious amendments that are being undertaken here. And they are removing from the Income Tax Act items relating to Genesis Power Limited, Meridian Energy Limited, Mighty River Power Limited, Solid Energy. So they're removing them from the Tax Act. They're removing them from a fundamental piece of legislation. Why is there not something on the table right now in SOP number 41 called the Income Tax Taking Away the Profits that New Zealanders get from these State-Owned Assets Amendment Act? It may not be that title, Mr Chair. Mr Williamson possibly would want something with fewer words in it, but it could be that title. So not actually having the Income Tax Act amendment, fewer words, I said fewer, yep, fewer words. We could have an app. If it was the Minister and the Chair, it may be more appropriate that there was some kind of app that was created that could actually do that for us. Smartgate, that's right. But those amendments to the Income Tax Act are now lost within the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act. But there's another curiosity, Mr Chair, in this matter, and that is that, in fact, what is now going to be the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act also includes amendments to the Public Finance Act. Now that, I think, creates an internal contradiction here, Mr Chair, because the second bill that's being divided here is the Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Act, and I endorse the comments made by Russell Norman and Winston Peters on the Freudian nature of that title. But actually, we're now also amending the Public Finance Act within the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act. Perhaps the Minister would like to explain to us exactly how that works. Wouldn't it make more sense in this division bill to have included what was Clause 8 of Part 1 of the Mixed Ownership Model Bill into the Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Bill? Now, if that's a bit confusing for those listening on their crystal sets, Mr. Chair, Maurice Williamson's aware of crystal sets, the Public Finance Act, Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Act is the second. They've got, that's almost worth getting on the record, isn't it? Mr. Peters said he's got earrings made of them, which I think is very good. The Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Amendment Act does not include the Public Finance Amendments of Part 1.
Member Maggie Barry.
I move that the question be now put.
No, I'm going to